Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editor-in-chief.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj, managing editor at MEI. When Hamas carried out its horrific October 7th terrorist attack against Israel, sparking a devastating retaliatory war in Gaza, many observers predicted that the consequences of these events could spill over into other theaters, redraw regional alliances, and upend the future trajectory of the Middle East. 2 years on, there is finally hope that the immediate conflict is coming to an end. But how has the region reshaped in the interim? What are the critical hinge points and possible future scenarios to watch for? Will the ceasefire in Gaza hold? And what role can the United States and its partners play in restabilizing the region while adapting to its new geopolitical realities?
On this week's episode, we're joined by a colleague who's been carefully thinking through all of these and related issues, MEI Senior Fellow Paul Salem. Paul is the author or editor of a number of different books, including, among others, Escaping the Conflict Trap and From Chaos to Cooperation.
Thank you, Alistair and Matt. Thank you for having me on the podcast. Happy to get into it.
Let's dive right in. We saw a major development this week with the signing of the first phase of a new Gaza ceasefire in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt on Monday, October 13th. We're speaking to you now, just to timestamp things, on Tuesday. How did we get to this point, and where does the region stand on a macro level 2 years on from October 7th?
Thank you, Alistair. In a way, there are two separate arenas or trajectories. The ceasefire that we saw announced earlier this week, we'll get back and talk about it. It certainly is great and welcome news for the Israeli hostages, for the Palestinians in Gaza, for those released on the Palestinian side as well. It will have consequences immediately on Gaza, and there are various scenarios there, and we will talk about them. But the response to October 7 involved a complete change of strategy by Israel towards the region, and then included a decapitation, devastation of Hezbollah, which changed the situation in Lebanon. That then had a knock-on effect on Syria, led to the collapse of the regime in Syria and a new order emerging in Syria. So those are two big changes. And it also led to the first direct Israeli attacks on Iran, the first direct American attacks on Iran. So there are other arenas that have been affected, separate, obviously, from the Gaza arena, separate from the Israel-Palestine arena, and I'm sure we'll get to talk about all of those. The ceasefire and the exchange of hostages that we saw earlier this week was extremely significant in itself. Those hostages to come home, the massive suffering in Gaza to come to a halt, an opening to get humanitarian aid in, and maybe, eventually reconstruction and other things as well. So in itself, it is a very, very major breakthrough. Sadly, this breakthrough could have happened 9 months ago, could have happened a year and a half ago, and it's sad to realize that at the end of the day, this deal could have been arrived at earlier. Why was it arrived at now? I think the proximate cause was the sharp disagreement, let's say, between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump, triggered by the Israeli attack on Qatar. I think that really was a wake-up moment for President Trump. That was something that I feel he thought that Prime Minister Netanyahu was really overstepping the mark and launching an attack on a friend of Donald Trump, on an ally of the United States, and doing it without consulting his big brother, as it were. And I think Trump reacted very, very sharply to that and pivoted back to something Trump has been saying since the day he was elected back in November, that there needs to be a ceasefire and an end to this war. And I think that sort of sharp divergence between the two leaders impelled Trump to really take the bit and, to take the bit in his mouth, as it were, and to just make it happen by sheer force of willpower. So I think that's kind of how we got here. I think the contributing factors was also a lot of pressure on Hamas from the Gulf countries, who realized that if this drags on, given the attack on Qatar, that they might be dragged into danger as well, so that they have national security interests linked to getting this over. And I think they piled on the pressure on Hamas while Trump piled on the pressure on Israel. I don't know if this third factor was a direct contributor or not, but certainly the increasing isolation of Israel in the world community, the European declarations of support for a Palestinian state, I think alerted many in the US administration that Israel was losing a lot of ground internationally, and there really was nothing more to be gained from fighting in Gaza, and that this needed to change quickly.
We'll be exploring the ceasefire deal and where things might be headed from here in more detail later on in the episode. But for now, I wanted to kind of zoom out and give our listeners a sort of 30,000-foot view of the region over the past 2 years. What, as you see it, have been the largest shifts and who have emerged as the sort of biggest winners and losers out of everything that's happened?
On the geopolitical scene, there's no doubt that Israeli military power has proven somewhat hegemonic, that they've shown they can hit as much as they want, wherever they want. Yes, Donald Trump can rein them in, but nobody else can. And that they can obviously reach all the way to Tehran at will. That is a major change. Previous to October 7, there was a kind of a balance of power between Israel on one side and Iran and its proxies on the other. Israel did not feel so militarily empowered to strike wherever it wanted. And on the flip side, Iran certainly has been a net loser. It's not a total loser, but it's a net loser. They lost the crown jewel of their deterrent capacity, which was Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah still exists and very much alive, but is no longer able to serve a strategic function for Iran, which was to deter an Israeli or American attack. That no longer works. Israel and America are not deterred, and Hezbollah is largely out of commission. So Iran has lost deterrence. It cannot defend against Israeli or Iranian attacks. Those are major strategic losses for Iran. It still has a large network. Obviously, the Houthis have not been terribly affected. They've continued to operate. The Hashd militias in Iraq are still as powerful as they were, if not more. Hezbollah still exists, but weaker. And Hamas, for all the battering that it took, is still standing 2 years later. So that's not a total loss either. We don't know how Iranian leadership will rethink its strategies. I know there have been a number of podcasts from MEI investigating just that. So I guess we're waiting. I would say a geopolitical reaction to this as well, and this really was highlighted by the attack on Qatar, is that most countries in the region in the previous period looked at Iran as sort of the dangerous player and the one that's projecting power into their backyard and destabilizing their countries and was a disruptive force. Now, a lot of countries, Gulf countries certainly, but increasingly Turkey and Egypt to some degree, feeling that Israel is now a loose cannon, a bit of a rogue actor, and that Israel is kind of adopting Iran's forward defense strategy. That Israel says, wherever there's a threat anywhere in the Middle East, and I decide if it's a threat, I'm going to go after it. Well, that's not a strategy that other states in the region can live with. But so on the geopolitical side, there's a lot of beginning of reaction to the new perceived Israeli threat. Now, maybe Israel and the US can quickly try to reassure countries and so on, but that was the mood. I was just in a conference with a lot of Gulf officials and Turkish officials, and they were really, really alarmed and strategically thinking this through about what this means for them. The other major effect of the 2 years of war is in public opinion. That public opinion in the Middle East, this would be the Arab world, Turkey, Palestine goes without saying, Iran, probably in the wider Muslim world, to say nothing of Europe and the United States, but to talk about the Middle East itself, public opinion is sharply affected by what happened, passionately supportive and seized of the Palestinian issue, very, very hostile to the actions, the extent of the actions that Israel took. Everybody understood that there would be a retaliation to the attacks, the horrific attacks of October 7, but the campaign on Gaza over the last 2 years and the statements from Israeli officials, many of whom openly were saying, we want to push them out, or we might want to starve them, or this and that, really has really dramatically and for a long time changed public opinion in the region, let alone in the world. And that might have knock-on effects on future Abraham Accords and so on we can talk about. Let me end by saying that the war also had economic costs that are still being tallied. Certainly big cost on Egypt and the Suez Canal. Obviously enormous cost, kind of a 50% loss of the Palestinian economy in general. A lot of contracts and investments that were going to happen between the Gulf and Israel did not happen. Other projects were put on hold, like IMEC corridor and other things. So there was also an economic and geoeconomic cost for all of this.
Following up on some of the points you made there, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared early on in the war that Israel was, quote, changing the face of the Middle East. Do you think he's succeeded in doing that? And is this, quote unquote, new Middle East actually one that's safer for Israel?
Well, I think he's created the potential for that. But as I've written in a number of pieces for MEI, he's winning the wars, but he has been unable to win the peace. He's been unable to turn military battles or victories in battle into sustainable political arrangements that at least are good for Israel in the long term and are sustainable, and also sustainable in the region. I think a lot of that is there for the picking, but Netanyahu has not gone in that direction. And I think Netanyahu and his government are unable to go in that direction. And hence, I think the fruition of these various changes might require elections or new leadership in Israel. I mean, the obvious, I almost call it low-hanging fruit at this point, but given the weakening of Iran and given all that's happened, the pathway to reaching out to Saudi Arabia, negotiating with the Palestinians, a pathway forward, and building on that, a normalization with Saudi Arabia, which would then probably unlock normalization with Syria and Lebanon and Indonesia and Malaysia and other countries. That is such a transformative thing for Israel in the region, but that's something that requires serious concessions to the Palestinians that this government is unable to do. If you look at the Israeli-Palestinian situation, even forgetting Saudi Arabia and Syria and Lebanon and the region, Israel today is not in a more secure, long-term strategic situation vis-a-vis the Palestinians. October 7 is unlikely to happen again, but it shouldn't have happened in the first place. They should have known that it was going to happen. There were hardly any effective defenses on the southern border. So absolutely that shouldn't and wouldn't happen again. But the idea that you can brutalize 5 million Palestinians and then continue to live side by side and hope that that's going to be great and peaceful without any political pathway, without any alternative to the present realities is just ludicrous, unrealistic. And in a way, if you go back and see who started this, which was Yahya Sinwar and Hamas, they wanted to get here. They wanted to get to a situation where Israelis are so enraged that they attack Palestinians. Palestinians become so enraged so that there's no political pathway, there's no compromise that's possible between the two sides. That's sort of the Islamist, kind of extremist Islamist approach. That's kind of the Iranian approach, no Israel, period. So in a way, Sinwar and I would say the extreme right wing in Israel are getting their way, but that is not a sustainable situation for Israel and Israelis, even if you just think about the Palestinians, let alone the Gulf and other countries.
You've just alluded in various ways to this following perspective, this following interpretation that Israel's national security theory seems to be to prevent strong states from arising on its borders. But of course, this is in some ways antithetical to its demands that those neighbors, especially Lebanon and Syria, work to prevent their territories from being used against Israel. So first, do you agree with that? Is that a perspective that is widely shared in the region today? And if so, how is the region already realigning to try to deal with a neighbor with that sort of security mindset?
They're not opposed to, let's call them semi-strong states. They're not going to be comfortable with any state in the region which has more which has nuclear weapons or, more effective airplanes or whatever than they have, but there's nobody that comes close. But they are in favor of strong with a small s and stable states like Egypt, like Jordan, like Saudi, and so on. When it comes to Syria and Lebanon, their hostility to the new order or the new regime in Damascus is a hostility to President Shara and the radical Islamist background that he comes from. And hence they have not only don't they have trust, they believe that, at the end of the day, he will be deeply hostile to them. You add to that they are not at all comfortable with his strong Turkish backing and the idea that if Turkey builds a strong presence in Syria, that means Turkey, in effect, has a border with Israel. They're happy to get rid of Iran, but they're not happy to welcome Turkey on their northern border. So they have a very specific concern and position vis-a-vis Syria. Vis-a-vis Lebanon, it's different. No, they are looking favorably at the gradual, tentative rise of the Lebanese state and the Lebanese army. They know that, in the best of worlds, it'll take a good while, 2-3 years, for this really to come to full fruition. What they're saying vis-a-vis Lebanon is that they welcome and they think this is a good thing, the rise of the state, but they're also saying we can't wait. We're going to go ahead and do what we feel we need to do to counter Hezbollah here and now when we see a threat. That sort of distance between the Israeli position and the Lebanese position is something the American mediators and others are trying to bridge that gap. The concern in the region is not so much about failed states or emerging states. It's the concern of established states that Israel at any point could target them, like Iran targeted Saudi Arabia, a few years ago out of the blue. Now they have to worry, that if Israel has something it doesn't like in Turkey, maybe they'll do a bombing run in Turkey. They did a bombing run in Qatar, obviously. That could happen then in any other place. That's the nature of the concern among the established states, and I would say in Egypt as well. And I think what this is causing, and this is still early days because it's only been, 2-3 weeks since the attack on Qatar, you're seeing much more reconsideration of the relations between the Gulf countries, Turkey, and Iran and Egypt. We have a lot of concerns with Iran and Pakistan, obviously. Let me add Pakistan to the mix. You see Pakistan coming back into the sort of Middle Eastern calculations. So I think the Gulf countries, Egypt, Turkey, some of them are reaching out to each other, some of them are reaching out to Pakistan, and some are considering a bit more interaction with Iran since they've resolved many of their issues with Iran, and they want to encourage Iran to continue to moderate, but they also don't feel very comfortable that they put all of their eggs in the Israeli and American basket, and it came back to bite them. So they are concerned, and things are happening.
We're going to get into the summit that happened in Egypt with the Gaza peace agreement signed in a moment. Before we do you think that what we just witnessed, do you think that it could serve as a kind of reset on regional threat perceptions of Israel and Iran?
I think in a sense indirectly, because I think now that the Israeli hostages are back in Israel, whatever happens going forward in Gaza, it might not be a full and permanent ceasefire. There might be other operations down the road. But I think the days of massive Israeli fury and devastation, I think that is behind us because a lot of that was fueled or justified by the continued holding of these Israeli hostages by Hamas. So I'm assuming that whatever happens in Gaza, and it's a very bumpy road, I don't think we're going to see what we saw over the last 2 years. And I think, therefore, both the emotions in the region and in the world will begin to calm down a bit. If not every day you see 100 killed, starvation and so on, it'll calm down. And I think Israel will calm down from this sort of unfettered fury that it was living effectively to a much more sort of a guarded approach. So yes, I think that will help calm the situation and help people begin to distance themselves from what happened in Qatar and reconnect. And I don't mean to imply at all that anybody was cutting at all their relations with Israel or not continuing to think that Israel is a potential partner or a current partner, but there was some hedging going on that this actor could occasionally bite us as well. So we gotta think about it.
Following up on the Sharm el Sheikh summit, what are the next steps in the implementation of the Gaza peace plan? What still needs to be negotiated, and do you think they can maintain the momentum?
Well, I'm very concerned. The steps are, theoretically or literally laid out. Well, in the very short term, Hamas is still supposed to hand over the remains of deceased hostages, which Israel say that they have not. That might take some time. The agreement says Hamas should disarm. First of all, it's not clear what that means, disarm with what weapons. That needs to be A, discussed in terms of what that means, and B, it's not clear that Hamas will agree to it. So those are sort of pretty obvious things that need to happen in the next days and weeks. In the broader perspective of the plan in general, there needs to be talks to clarify how will Palestinians be selected to be the technocratic team that will manage the situation or manage the aid and assistance that's coming in. The agreement says this will be a group of Palestinian technocrats. How will they be selected? Who chooses them? That needs to be clarified. The plan calls for an international stabilization force of military, armed units from armies, some of them probably from the region, possibly Egypt or Jordan or Emirates, and maybe some from Europe. That has not been spelled out. That needs discussion. And how do they get in? And what are their, orders? Who do they shoot at if they have to? Are they a peacekeeping force or a peace building force? Some countries in the Gulf are saying they won't do it unless there's UN Security Council resolution legitimizing it. So that's another, issue to be discussed. And then to complete the structure, then there's the Committee of Peace that's chaired by President Trump. We know Tony Blair supposedly is supposed to chair it or be part of it. Who else is going to be in that? So there's this whole, what is Hamas going to give up and so on, so that we can get to the new governance structure. That's the plan. However, when I look at the players, if I look at Hamas itself, Hamas has survived 2 years of a fierce onslaught. They're still standing. At the end of the day, Israel and the U.S. had to negotiate with them. I don't see that now that they've survived this onslaught, they're going to say, okay, we're going to, commit suicide or harakiri, and here are all our weapons, and we leave the scene and we'll go into exile. I don't see that happening. They are very present in Gaza. They're the most present, obviously, organization among the Palestinians. So what their decisions are moving forward are very important, and I don't see them giving up. I don't see them necessarily welcoming the return of the Palestinian Authority and their Fatah rivals. Now, the way they're putting it, they say, well, we have to talk amongst ourselves as Palestinians and figure this out, and Egypt may be helpful, but there's a whole issue there. On the Israeli side, I think it's, the Netanyahu government can be very, very pleased and satisfied that the hostages have come home. However, a number of things. They have said that they want to, their goal was to eliminate and obliterate Hamas. That has not been achieved. Ben Gvir and Smotrich might still bolt the government if the war is not resumed against Hamas. You could say it's easier now to go after Hamas because there are no hostages there, so they don't have to be as restrained as before. So there's that dynamic. I'm quite certain that this Israeli government is not eager for any military force from another state to enter Gaza at this point and, be in the way in case they want to do something. I don't see how they would welcome that step. I'm also not sure that they want to bring in a Palestinian authority of some kind, not the Palestinian Authority, and have the world give them money and give them recognition. So I think they're very hesitant to go in that direction. And the whole strategy of the U.S. plan is to handle Gaza in order to pivot to discussions with Saudi Arabia. That's the big, game-changing event in the region, and the Netanyahu government knows it. And that this Netanyahu government absolutely does not want to be dragged into any talks with the Palestinians about anything resembling or even the words two-state solution. So the plan is nice, the plan is clear, but at the end of the day, given that I think the two parties, this Israeli government and this Hamas, I don't think are very much plugged into the whole deal, but the US is, and the region is, and hopefully many Israelis are. And there are elections coming up sometime next year, maybe towards the end of it, if not sooner. But for the time being, this is a Trump plan. And Trump showed that he can make it happen if he puts his weight in it. But for it to happen, he's going to have to continue to be very, very strongly involved, lean on Netanyahu heavily, lean on the Arab states to lean on Hamas, really keep all the stops out. Now, the fact that he's appointed himself the chairman of this governance council, as it were, of Gaza is a good sign that maybe he will remain engaged. And if he can vie for the 2026 Nobel Prize, maybe that's added incentive.
But he's certainly got a lot on his plate. He seems already keen to pivot to Russia, Ukraine, to talk about Iran that he flagged in his comments to the Israeli parliament as well. So definitely a very fair point, but he does have a few other things on his plate at the moment for sure.
Yeah. I mean, one way to look at it, my assessment is really we're not going to make significant progress on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, hence on this normalization and integration into the region issue. That's not going to happen with this Israeli government. So maybe it's dead time strategically. And maybe the best we can hope for is stop the war in Gaza, get humanitarian aid in, get some reconstruction, let them at least relive beginnings of normal lives, and wait for change in Israel. Not just wait for it, but engage with the Israeli public to show them that there is this tremendous historic opportunity, and also to make the point that Israel is so militarily hegemonic. There are no threats. I mean, Iran cannot attack Israel, really. Obviously, Hezbollah and Hamas cannot. Nobody else is going to attack. And it's a high point of Israeli security. You'd think, well, now is the time to cash in and do all the political deals, because really you've taken care of the security threats, except you can say, yes, there's still a little bit of a missile threat from Iran, but pretty limited. There's no nuclear threat. There's no Hamas threat. There's no Hezbollah threat. The Houthi threat, even by Israeli account, is not an actual threat. It's an irritant. So they're in a very, very strong position, but they're not translating it into actual gains.
Yeah, I think to your point, it was quite notable that the Israeli Prime Minister did not attend the summit in Cairo.
Notice that neither he nor the Iranians attended. The two
Indeed.
really don't want the two-state solution.
Yeah, and there were different accounts as to why that happened, but it does underscore the reality of Israel's diplomatic isolation in the region that you pointed to.
Also, in this maybe strategic dead time on the Israeli-Palestinian Saudi front, it could be a very alive time and an opportunity for Trump to pivot to Iran. Now, the Iranians are very tough customers. I'm not sure they're all in on a big deal, but they are very worried. Their security situation is terrible. Their economic and resource situation is terrible. They're very unpopular at home. And they've seen that Trump is pretty flexible in making deals. Whatever it is, I think it's very strategically valid for Trump to make a really big push with Iran, and with the help of the Turks, the Gulfis, who all now have reasonable relations with the Iranians. It took an enormous push to get the ball over the goal line in Gaza. I think the Iran thing deserves a big push. If he's able to make a big push and get a good deal, that will also reverberate back to Israel and say, wow, we look to be in a much safer environment. Let's talk peace. So that it could have a rebound effect.
But you do think that any sort of effort to revisit the Abraham Accords, to kind of push for that track of regional integration, normalization, would require a new government in Israel?
I think the big push, meaning the normalization with Saudi, yes, would require. I think progress can be made in Gaza, just by dogged pushing from Trump. Get those Palestinian technocrats in place, get aid flowing, get humanitarian aid, some reconstruction. I think that can happen, but I don't think normalization with Saudi can happen. One can try, but opinion polls in Saudi Arabia, as we hear from Saudi sources, like 98% of opinion in Saudi Arabia is against normalization with Israel at this time. So it ain't going to happen in this situation with this government without something very significant for the Palestinians. And not to say it harshly, but the Palestinians are in such dire straits that I think they're, in a mood to negotiate as well. And they're very much realizing that their future lies with the Gulf, that they have to coordinate with the Gulf. They realize that they're not going to have a state with an air force and missile systems, and that's not in the cards. But a state with other capacities is certainly possible. Well, possible theoretically if you get a partner in Israel.
Paul, it seems from just a purely practical standpoint, for there to be any longer-term progress on establishing a Palestinian state, Palestine would need to be more closely integrated into the rest of the region. But is that actually possible without bringing Israel along?
It would be necessary to bring Israel along. The main countries want to bring Israel along. Yeah, that's not a contradiction. That's a win-win. And that was just discussed in the conference I was at a couple of days ago. The Palestinians saying we want to be more integrated with the Gulf countries. And for that to be a sustainable and stable arrangement, we need Israel as well to be in that same integration so that everybody's reinforcing the same relationships. And yeah, so I think the opportunity, as I said, call it low-hanging fruit. I mean, it sounds as if that's too easy, but it's ripe for the picking, but it's going to take some bold leadership in Israel to get over October 7 and what happened. And one can understand, the reaction and the horror and all of that, but to again think strategically and think for the long term.
The prevailing narrative about the U.S. role in the Middle East for a long time now has been that it's been one of growing disengagement and gradual loss of influence. And the past, half year or so of Trump's first year in office seems to make it hard to continue to argue that. What do you think has been the main driving factor behind the White House reprioritizing the Middle East region?
Well, I mean, it was reprioritized a bit under the Biden administration. I would say a number of things. One was the Russian war in Ukraine and all the effects that had. Under the Biden administration, it was effects on energy markets and all of that. And a fear that now that Russia is contesting Europe, there's more of a fear that what if we also lose the Middle East to either China or Russia? So reprioritizing that. Under Trump, it was prioritized maybe in a different way and very strongly. One would have to say, he likes the leaders of the Gulf. He has a lot of business deals there. He's the leaders that he's most comfortable with in the world. And they know that, and the relationships are deep and strong, including with his family. Secondly, I think the artificial intelligence and digital deals that were made are historic in the sense that if the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st was about oil, and then it was oil and gas, and then it was energy transition and all of those issues, and those are still very much present, but the future is going to be determined a lot by AI. The U.S. realized it doesn't have enough energy capacity to do the AI enough to compete with China, so brought in the Gulf countries as long-term strategic partners in the future of AI and digital. That did not happen as much under Biden. It didn't come to fruition as much. It was part of the discussion. So I think that cements the Gulf very, very strongly with the U.S. on the digital sphere. Now, what happened in Israel, Gaza, I think simply sucked America in because Israel is so important in American politics and has made it the case that President Trump has to devote an enormous amount of energy simply to manage the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to bring it to an end. The conflagration also dragged the U.S. effectively into its first direct war with Iran. So those were kind of effects of the conflagration. And for better or for worse, the Middle East is now very strongly embedded in U.S. thinking. From the Middle East point of view, whereas maybe 5 years ago, a lot of countries in the region were really looking at the world in a more, much more a seriously multipolar way. I think things are a bit different now on the strategic level. One, the Russian war in Ukraine eliminated really Russia as a serious strategic security player. That it looked like, as effective as Ukraine or Iran or any sort of middle-level player, whereas the image of Russia militarily in the Middle East used to have the echoes of the Soviet Union. So I think Russia dealt itself out as a strategic player. And I think people have realized when it comes to China that, yes, they're the biggest player in terms of trade and commerce, but they have no interest in a strategic role or a strategic game in any serious way. And that the U.S. is able and is willing, and its military hardware still is the best in the world. So I think the U.S. is very engaged in the Middle East, and the Middle East remains at the security level and at the technology level now sort of very much married to the U.S. or joined at the hip.
And on that, how should the U.S. policymakers navigate this current context? What should Washington be doing to further stabilize the region?
Well, I think the roadmap that, maybe both the Democratic president and Trump has laid out is the right one. End the war in Gaza, work towards normalization with Saudi, which means work towards some kind of resolution for the Palestinians, some kind of entity, a state with a small s, something. That is the correct way to go. That will tremendously help stabilize the region. Work for a strong and lasting and secure deal with Iran that would eliminate the nuclear threat and force it or encourage it to really give up or weaken or step away from its proxy network in the region. That absolutely is helpful and needs to be done. So those main points are still very valid. And Trump is very serious about them. And that's, I look at that as a positive point. There were two opportunities that sort of arose. These are smaller ones, but are important ones. And those are the opportunities in Syria and Lebanon. These were two countries that were lost, and both now are potentially salvageable or rebuildable. Lebanon is on a positive and strong trajectory. The U.S. is very supportive. It should stay the course. It should manage the relationship with Israel so as to enable and encourage the rise of the state and the weakening of Hezbollah. Syria still has a very, very long road to go. It's a very extremely still unstable situation. It's very good that the U.S. and Trump lifted sanctions on Syria. That's something very good. Unfortunately, it's far from enough. Syria has no standing army, has no really standing state. It is just a guy in the presidential palace who's saying nice things. I think there needs to be a strong coordination to help, to press, to pressure the new order in Syria to quickly build its national army, press Israel not to destroy it again. It needs a national army, it needs a national police force, it needs the state institutions to function again. That will give confidence to the Kurds, the Druze, the Alawis to integrate further. So there's work to be done in Syria beyond lifting the sanctions. So I think, the game plan is clear. How much can be done in the next couple of years or in the next 3 years in Trump's term, I don't know. But the direction is clear.
We've covered a lot of ground in today's conversation, but before we wrap up, I just wanted to get your kind of final thoughts on where you see things going from here, especially when we're at a moment of such change in the region and such change in the regional order as well. Where do you see things going from here? Where do you see as the possible scenarios moving forward?
Well, I mean, we've talked a little bit, a lot, I guess, about the geopolitics and the moves that should be made on the various geopolitical arenas and war ending and negotiation and deals. And those are very important. One thing that I guess we didn't mention, but I and many in the region worry about, is that these 2 years have radicalized, or let's say have enraged or impassioned an entire generation certainly in the Middle East. I mean, obviously we see it in the US, we see it in Europe, but we're talking about the Middle East now. Certainly, all of those in Gaza, there's serious worries that the blowback could be very unpredictable and dangerous. This could be blowback against governments. We're already seeing kind of blowback against governments in Europe that didn't do anything during these 2 years and now are standing with the Palestinian state because they have internal risks. We saw President Macron said that he expects terrorist attacks in France. There's a similar worry that the Arab governments, who effectively did nothing for the last 2 years, that there could be blowback against that. We're seeing already some of that in Morocco, that in the protests that erupted in Morocco, which are largely about the usual things of employment and corruption, but now also the Palestinian flag is there. What did you do to stop the bloodshed in Gaza over 2 years? That could haunt Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, Saudi Arabia. It's impossible to predict, but there's a lot of anger out there and a lot of blood has been shed. And nothing good ever comes of that. You sow the wind, you do reap the whirlwind. Where that whirlwind is going to come from, I don't know. I think on the policy side, the recommendation is get ahead of it. Make progress in a positive way to absorb as much of that risk and as much of that whirlwind as you can absorb. And I think that's what the European countries tried to do. But I think there needs to be steps between Israel and the Arab states and the Palestinians, or else, blood begets blood, and that's not a good cycle to be in at all.
That's all the time we have for this week. Paul, thank you very much for joining us on the program.
Thank you, Alistair. Thank you, Matt. And I hope the positive scenario is the one that wins out.
We're certainly hoping the same, and we hope to have you back and have a discussion that ends on a slightly more cheery note, but we'll see how things go.
Inshallah. All right.
A warm thanks also goes out to our listeners for tuning in, as well as to our production team for all of their work on this week's episode.
To find MEI's latest coverage of geopolitics and foreign relations in the Middle East, please visit our website, www.mei.edu. You can also follow MEI on X, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events.
I'm Alistair Taylor.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj. We hope you'll listen in again next week.